and welcome to this episode of the Capitalized Life and Retirement Show. I'm your host, Matthew Johnson, president and owner of Johnson Wealth and Income Management, a retirement income source located in Clear Lake, Humboldt, and Ankeny, Iowa. Well, how are you today? Glad that you're here, whether you're listening on a podcast platform or maybe you're watching this video on YouTube or maybe through our website, johnsonwim.com. Either which way, I'm so very grateful to have you here. You know, I often get asked as a veteran advisor, what's the best way to protect my assets? And when I think of that question, I kind of distill it down to potentially three areas. Number one, preserving principal. That could be, listen, I've worked too hard for my principal. I don't want it to be lost to stock market declines. I can think of that. Number two, I can imagine avoiding probate. When we think about what happens to the average person or the average family when someone dies, when a parent dies, that set of assets is going to go through the probate process. And that probate process is going to be costly. And especially if you have a lot of assets like farm ground, that could be a whole ton of dough that your family now has to cough up in order to be able to keep your assets. Number three is going to be the potential danger of what's called the spend-down process. When you think about kind of the worst case scenario, person going into the nursing home, and the nursing home costs a lot of money, and it uses up all of their financial resources. Well, at that point, now you have to start liquidating hard assets, generally speaking, in order to be able to apply and become eligible for something called Medicaid. And that's where the state takes care of you. Well, the reality is that the spend down process is the painful part, and people want to figure out how to avoid that. So today, I thought we would take the time, not necessarily to talk about your principal and how to preserve that, because there's literally hundreds of hours of dialogue on that. But rather, let's discuss number two and number three. How to avoid probate, and number two, how to avoid the spend down process. So it's not as complicated as what we might make it. We're human beings, and this is something that I talk about in my book, The Capitalized Retirement. I've got plenty of white papers at johnsonwim.com that you can read through on this. But the reality is that when a person dies, if they have a will, they are going to be likely having all of their assets go through the probating process. Now, granted, there are states like the state of Iowa, for instance, that if you don't have, so many dollars worth of assets and you die, well, you're not going to get probated. But let's say that limit is $50,000. Most individuals, by the time you think of all the resources and the assets that they have the house, they have the car, they have money in the bank, so on and so forth. Well, most individuals are going to end up going through probate. And so how do we avoid doing that? Well, the simple answer is we avoid going through probate by having the right type of estate plan, which generally speaking is not going to be a will, it's going to be a trust. And that trust, whether it's a revocable or an irrevocable, is basically the bucket in which you're now naming assets to become the owner of that asset, so that when you die, when the courts look at you, they go, oh, well, you don't have anything. And if you don't have anything, well, then you can't be probated. But let's get to number three, because number three is a big one. How do I avoid the spend down process in Medicaid? Well, number one, this is going to go back to something that's so very basically simple. We forget about it. And that is, if you don't want to go through Medicaid, number one, make certain that you're preserving your principal. Because you see, if you go into the nursing home and you have resources, you have principal that is available to pay for your care, well, then you may never probably have to go on to Medicaid. But let's go a step further. Let's say that you're not the average. Let's say that you stay in the nursing home for longer than 2.5 years. And we know with today's prices that nursing homes and skilled care facilities are very, very expensive. Well, how are we going to pay for that? Well, the reality is that if you would invest your principal properly for income, and what I mean by that is you've got real interest, you've got real dividends that are being produced all from your principal. That interest and dividend income, if used wisely, and if you have the health to be able to become eligible for this, you can be using that income in order to be able to pay for long-term care insurance. You see, in the same way that I don't want to be responsible if I wreck my car in having to buy a new car, and I have automobile coverage, I have now shifted the responsibility of that liability onto the shoulders of the insurance company. In the same way that I have taken and I have insured my home with homeowners coverage so that if a tree falls on my home, if I go through a tornado, both of which have happened, the reality is that I have now shifted the burden of responsibility to that insurance company. Do we know if we're going to go to the nursing home? Absolutely not. Do we know how long we'll be there if we go? No. So there's a whole bunch of uncertainties. But let me ask you, do you know if you're going to get into a car accident? Do you know if your house is going to burn down to the ground? And the answer is no. You've got about a 1 and 2% chance of going and receiving some sort of long-term care, whether it's home health care, independent living, skilled care, cognitive care. You've got a 1 in 2 chance, about a 50% probability of needing some sort of long-term care in your future. Whereas the statistical odds are much, much lower of your house burning to the ground or you getting into a car accident. So you see, if you really want to avoid the Medicaid Spenddown process, I suppose you could go through all of the more technical and legal loopholes to be able to open up an irrevocable trust and put the asset into the trust, and then wait the 5 years and just cross your fingers and toes, hoping that nothing happens in the 5-year period that you're waiting. Or maybe you say, you know what, I'm just going to do this the right way. I'm going to buy coverage that's going to be able to protect me from that liability. And I can hear it now. I can hear it as sure as I'm sitting here. That you're going to be saying, but I don't want to pay premium for coverage, Matthew, that I may never use. And I get it. I totally get it. But let's just think about it. How many years, how many decades have we paid for, say, homeowners insurance and we've never had a claim? How many decades have we paid for automobile coverage and never totaled out our vehicle? Okay? So the reality is that we're looking at the statistical odds and we're saying, you know what, with maybe a 1 and 2 chance, a 50% chance that I may need some sort of long-term care. Again, there's such a variety of different types of care out there, but I want coverage to be able to protect me from that liability. Well, my friends, if you've got real income that's being produced off from your principal, that income can be used to pay for that care. And here's the thing. If you happen to live in a state like the state of Iowa that has legal agreements called partnership programs with real legitimate long-term care insurance companies that say, listen, if you buy $500,000 worth of coverage, we will guarantee you and your family that we will avoid $500,000 worth of assets if it ever becomes a reality that you have to go into the nursing home and all of your long-term care is used up. These are really, really interesting things to look into. And whether you use a life insurance policy that's a hybrid that will pay for long-term care, and if you don't use it or if you use only a little of it, it'll still pay a death claim. Those are the types of very interesting strategic products that we can have in our life that we can utilize effectively to be able to say, well, whether I go or whether I don't, my family is still going to receive a benefit. So, food for thought. I know that avoiding probate is so very important today. Do it the right way. do it by having a trust. If you feel that you can really legitimize the trust and you can utilize it to its fullest extent. If you've only got $50,000 worth of assets, well, then go ahead and utilize the will, because it probably won't be much of a probate. But if you're trying to avoid the probate process, but you're also thinking in the back of your mind, what if I go into the nursing home? What if I have to go on Medicaid? What if I run out of assets? My friends, there is a simple solution to that. Just make certain that your principal is producing the income so that you can buy the type of long-term care protection that you and your spouse and your family deserve. I'm Matthew Johnson. Thank you so much for listening and watching. And remember, it's up to you to make today a great day.